Let's talk leasing. It may be a path for you to have your dream home in tropical paradise. I'm Joe Remax, and I'm coming to you from my office here in Bangkok, Thailand. So, often when we think of leasing, we talk about renting year to year an apartment or a condominium. But did you know there's options for long-term leasing up to 30 years in Thailand, where you can legally have full rights to that property, any property in Thailand, for up to 30 years with an option to renew 30 years. That's what we're going to talk about today, and how can that work for you. So typically, we think of renting a condo or an apartment, as I said, year to year. But there's another option, the long-term lease. And this gives you an ability to lease any property, be it land or a villa on land, a condominium, anything you want. You can lease for up to 30 years with an option to renew 30 years. But you need to do it properly like anything else. So first of all leases are a maximum length of 3 years unless you register it with the land department. So when you do register it with the land department, you can lease up to 30 years. So this is one of the things you need to know. If someone presents a 30-year lease that has not been registered with the land department, it is only valid for the first 3 years. So why would you want to lease versus buy? Well, in Thailand, there are a lot of restrictions on what a foreigner can buy. You cannot buy land. So if you wanted to build a villa or have a townhouse, that kind of thing, you can't buy it. Now you can buy it in the name of a company, but there's a lot of complications involved, and it's kind of skirting the law. So leasing is a legal and long-term solution, although you don't own it for the rest of your life. So that's going to be the trade-off. You can have access to a leased property for up to 30 years with an option to renew. It has to be done correctly. Within the law, there are some small parts about survivability of a lease should the leaseor pass away, and it's easily covered within the contracts of the original lease, but it needs to be covered. Leasing from your wife doesn't work. So if you say, I'm going to buy my wife's name and I'm going to lease back from her, this is not a viable solution, in that the two of you are seen as a union, and it's viewed by the law, the land office, as a proxy ownership and is not valid. So what can you do? Let's say you wanted to build a home and you found a nice little piece of land that's affordable. You can lease that, or for current owner, you can lease it for 30 years with an option to renew 30 years. The option to renew does not always survive the transfer of property. So whatever has to be done, get a lawyer on your side. You can stipulate all the terms and conditions to ensure that your lease is safeguarded, but it needs to be done correctly up front. What are the downsides of it? Well, downsides are kind of, you don't own it. So eventually it's going to revert to the owner. It goes back. It's like leasing an apartment. You don't own it. Typically leaseholds, if you're buying property on their lease condition, are cheaper than buying outright. So that's a positive. Other positives, there's no restriction on what you can lease, meaning you could lease 1,000 acres of property if you want, or 100 hectares, or you can lease a villa that's got land attached to it. So the possibilities are much wider than when you go to buy, you need to buy a condominium and you need to buy foreign quota of that condominium. So this is a solution to people who say, I don't mind to rent long-term. You've locked in your rent. It's not going to change for the next 30 years. So you kind of pay up front and you got 30 years of occupancy. There is lower taxes on a lease. So when you enter into a lease, there is no transfer tax, withholding tax, that kind of thing. There's a lease registration tax of 1.1% of the value of the lease. that is shared equally unless otherwise agreed between you and the leaseor. When you lease a property, of course, you're not liable for any property tax on that property. Property taxes here are quite low. However, you never know what's going to happen in the next 30 years. It's normally the responsibility of the person who owns that land to pay the taxes on it. When you lease a property, you don't inherently have the right to sublease it, but you can. You just have to add that to the lease terms that you have the right to sublease. And now that gives you some more flexibility if you say, okay, I'm not sure I'm going to be here for 30 years. You just make sure that your contract allows you to sublease and you can lease it out for the remainder of the term. Downside, at the end of the lease, it's not yours, and you just have to factor that in. And what it does is also give you security. If you rent something for the maximum term of 3 years, you're not guaranteed that you can stay there another 3 years. The leaseor may decide, no, I don't want to lease it to you anymore. I want to up the rent. One of the good sides of a long-term lease is that you can pretty well have the security to know that it's yours for that period. And you won't be chased out and there'll be no increasing in rent. Short and long summary, it's not a bad option as long as you're not hoping to pass it on to your heirs. 10 years into the lease, maybe you can transfer your rights to another person and they might pay you a little less. I hope that shed some insights into this. So I have a video on buying land and why that may not be a good idea. Leasing is an option whereby you have a solid case. Foreigners can lease land all they want and you have sound footing to stand on. You have to recognize that leases are for a period of time. Share your ideas in the comments. Is leasing for you? What are your questions about it? What have you heard? So that's me, that's it, that's all I have to say. It's kind of a short video. I hope you enjoyed. Do like and share, comment below. Thank you very much for joining me. Hope to see you again. This is Joe Remax signing off from my office here in Bangkok, Thailand.